Today is going to be an interesting video because we are going to be taking a look at Black Sabbath. Unfortunately, the story isn't going to start with Sabbath. As a matter of fact, we're actually going to be taking a look at the incident that happened with Tony Iommi. And surprisingly, we're not even going to start with Tony Iommi. We actually need to take a look even further back, long before metal was even existed. We actually got to go all the way back to the 1920s, of all places. There was a jazz musician by the name of Django Reinhardt who was traveling in, this was still around a time to when horse and buggy was still more or less still operational. Late one night, Django and his wife actually decided to pull over on the side of the road and kind of get some sleep. Before he slept, he decided to come up with some music before he went to sleep. Working with candlelight, he accidentally knocked over the candle and set the entire tent on fire. The burns to both him and his wife were pretty severe. Django Reinhardt unfortunately had a terrible accident that ended up paralyzing both his ring and pinky. Doctors eventually ended up telling him that you ain't gonna be able to play guitar ever again. The thing about entrepreneurs and the creative mind of Django Reinhardt, he couldn't accept fate. So instead, he decided to innovate. Taking his knowledge of what he knew, he didn't necessarily reinvent the wheel, but he did change the style and the way he played guitar. He ended up coming up with his new technique of only using two fingers, because, well, since the other two were paralyzed, that was all he could work with. His new style of playing was actually so ahead of its time, some people would be floored just simply from the fact that some of the notes that he was playing, there are people with 4 fingers that can't do what he can, and he's only using 2. As impressive as this is, we then now could fast forward to the 1960s, where a young, inspiring musician by the name of Tony Iommi would actually find himself on his last day of his job at a steel mill. He actually came back home early thinking that he probably was never gonna return back to the steel mill. After having a conversation with his mom, berating him, he ended up reluctantly agreed. He went back and he ended up having to work on the press, which ended up being a big machine that would put thousands of pounds of pressure and it would cut plates of metal in half. Tony actually had no idea how to work the damn thing, but with help of co-workers, taking what information he had from them, he proceeded to work the press. Unfortunately, at some point, Tony Iommi wasn't paying attention, and ultimately he would actually find that his hand was too close to the press and severed a couple of his fingers. Blood was pouring all over the place. The steel mill workers actually put his fingers in a matchbox. This, of course, would be useless, and the fingers would actually just find their way into the trash because the doctors at the time couldn't really do anything about it. Tony Iommi was told that he would never be able to play guitar ever again. As a matter of fact, his manager from the steel mill actually stopped by to talk to Tony. He ended up coming up with some few choice words of inspiration. The manager actually even told Tony about Django Reinhardt. Given a newfound love and appreciation of music, much like Django, Tony Iommi also was facing an uphill battle of trying to relearn how to play guitar, now with severed fingers. Tony would then later end up coming up with a very unique style of trying to come up with makeshift fingertips.
Because my fingers were so sensitive and painful.
So I went ahead and tried to make myself something, and I did. I made some tips out of a squeezy bottle. I melted it down into a ball, and little ball like that, and then I got a hot old soldering iron and pushed it through, and then I made it fix onto my fingers, and I sat there all night then, rubbing it down so it had shaped like a finger. And then I had to put a piece of leather on so to grip the strings.
Coming up with these makeshift fingers, the job still wasn't done. Tony Iommi still had to come up with a way to essentially find a way to actually kind of grip the strings. Because with his new fingertips, they kind of weren't really cooperating that well. He actually kind of found that the gauges of the strings were too thick. He kind of had to come up with a lighter gauge in order to really feel comfortable in helping him grip the strings. So he ended up having to come up with lighter, thinner gauges of guitar strings. I believe I even heard one story that he actually may have actually used strings that is typically used for banjos. Regardless of how he came up with the strings, he did need to play with lighter strings in order to play. So this would have been somewhere in the 60s, bouncing around from one band to another. Tony Iommi also ended up discovering that essentially, given his new obstacle of having to come up with a way to play more comfortably, the style, the acid rock at the time that was predominantly popular, this didn't really jive too well to his playing style because he couldn't really play too long playing higher notes. The higher notes would add stress and fatigue to his fingers that, well, if he didn't have this steel mill accident, he probably would have been able to play just fine. With the strings, with his fingertips the way they are, he actually found that playing notes at a much more lower tone not only gave it more a demonic sound, it also, he was able to play more comfortably. The story goes that eventually Tony Iommi would land in a band called Earth. The story goes that Earth was actually trying to rehearse, and right across the street there actually was a cinema. The movie there was actually showcasing a horror flick. The scary movie that was being played was actually a scary movie called Black Sabbath. Geezer Butler was the one that ended up noticing it and thought the name was unique, so he decided to actually use that name to actually write a song that he had in mind. Presenting this new song to the band, they proceeded to record it. The story goes that the song was so legendary that the band no longer could be called Earth anymore, and the band ultimately ended up changing their name to Black Sabbath, and the rest is history.